Right at the end of World War II, between the years of 1944 and 1945, the Office of Strategic Services, the US's wartime predecessor to the CIA, deployed a group of agents to China and Southeast Asia, ostensibly to conduct covert operations in support of Allied forces and to subvert the Japanese efforts to maintain their occupied territories. Throughout my research, I have seldom come across a group of intelligence agents that were more impactful to US clandestine history and the development of modern counterinsurgency strategies than the men who were in OSS Detachment 202 in Southern Asia. As we prepare for my upcoming multi-part expose on the French Connection, I wanted to tide you all over with a short overview of 4 of the men in this detachment. If you are a regular viewer of this channel, treat this video as a prelude to the upcoming series, as many of these characters will reappear later on the channel. The men who will form the center of our story today would go on to be influential operators within the Cold War environment, involved in a wide range of covert activities, guerrilla wars, paramilitary operations, and most notably, their instrumentality in the development of the drug financing paradigm that would persist for the next decades. Detachment 202, in my view, can be seen as an incubator of sorts for the future class of American clandestine experts. I believe that these figures exemplify an elite cadre of cold warriors that would go on to shape post-war American foreign policy. In this video, we will be discussing 4 characters: the Spook, the General, the Operator, and the Mercenary. Stick around to see who these 4 characters are, as these characters' distinct but interwoven careers throughout the Cold War shines a light on the intricacies of US foreign policy and counterinsurgency theory more broadly. As always, if you are new to my channel, I cite all my sources in the description of every video. There will be a number at the top of the screen that coordinates to a source in the description. I encourage you to check out my sources, as there's always information that I have to leave out. So let's tell the story of the men of OSS Detachment 202. Let's begin.
I will do my level best to stand up for freedom and democracy around the world by keeping the United States of America strong and by keeping our eyes wide open as we welcome change in the world, but keeping our eyes wide open.
So to start, Detachment 202 was led in part by a man who will be familiar to those of you who have been watching the History of the CIA series to this point. That man was Colonel Paul Helliwell. Out of everyone that I've discussed on this channel so far, I can say that Paul Helliwell is the most often overlooked CIA figure, and, importantly to this series, one of the most critical drivers in the development of the CIA drug paradigm. Helliwell led OSS Detachment 202's secret intelligence unit in the southern Chinese state of Yunnan, helping the nationalist forces of Chiang Kai-shek against the communist forces under Mao Zedong during the end of World War II and the ongoing Chinese Civil War. Yunnan, of course, was the main Chinese province within the infamous Golden Triangle, which we'll get to in the next episode, but it was a region that would become the largest poppy producer in the world between the 1950s and the 1980s. Under the official title of Chief of Special Intelligence in China at the end of World War II, Helliwell's colleagues later claimed, in a now infamous quote in a 1980 Wall Street Journal article, that Helliwell gathered information during the war with 5-pound shipments of opium, or, quote, 3 sticky brown bars, according to one testimony. After the war, Paul Helliwell settled in Miami, where he worked for the CIA and founded a law firm that would assist the CIA in many of its operations. He also founded Castle Bank and Trust, which was a Bahamian-based bank that would be involved in several high-profile money laundering and organized crime-affiliated scandals. Many believe that Helliwell is also a benefactor to the Bay of Pigs. It's hard to substantiate that, but that many researchers do believe that. But most importantly, Helliwell worked to establish shell companies to help launder dirty funds into the real estate market in South Florida. He essentially embodied the role of a CIA paymaster, channeling black, unaccountable funds to secret operations. I don't want to go too much into Helliwell because he will be the main character of my upcoming series, and we will be discussing his career extensively in the next parts. However, for the purposes of this video, let's remember that CIA paymaster Helliwell was an officer in the OSS Detachment 202, and likely had a strong impression on the men that we are going to cover today. Helliwell's fingerprints as an agent and an operator can be seen in all these men that we are going to discuss today. So let's get into our 4 main subjects, starting with the Spook, E. Howard Hunt. If you've read anything about the CIA, you will recognize the name E. Howard Hunt. a larger-than-life figure in the early Central Intelligence Agency, and a true spook by all definitions of the word. Hunt details in his memoir that he got his start with American intelligence under Halliwell's OSS Detachment 202 in China. Hunt would then be a founding member of the CIA, and his career with the Central Intelligence Agency reads more like a Netflix show than reality. His animated and almost unbelievable career is fitting to his character, as he spent his evenings writing spy novels for most of his life, under various pen names. Following his time in China during the war, working from the CIA office in Mexico, Howard Hunt would be instrumental in Operation PB Success in 1954, which successfully overthrew the democratically elected government of Arbenz in Guatemala, and was the second of the big three coups under Allen Dulles' directorship of the CIA, following the overthrow of Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh in 1953, and subsequent to the 1960 overthrow of President Patrice Lumumba in the DRC. Following the installation of the military dictatorship of Castillo Armas in Guatemala, the country would eventually be used by the CIA and organized crime as a rallying point for the upcoming Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba. Operation PB Success and the overthrow of the Arbenz government, largely at the behest of the United Fruit Company, put Howard Hunt on the map as a serious operator and spook in the halls of Langley. Hunt would then go on to serve at various CIA stations before arriving at his second career highlight, in organizing the Bay of Pigs invasion. According to David Talbot, Hunt worked as a political liaison between Langley and the anti-Castro Cuban exile groups in Florida and Louisiana, that would eventually participate in the doomed invasion. Hunt reportedly trained Cuban exile mercenaries in Guatemala in preparation for the Bay of Pigs, which many speculate was partially funded by Halliwell's secret banking network, as we mentioned earlier. Hunt would then be reportedly spotted in Dallas on November 22, 1963, on the day of the Kennedy assassination. He is believed to be one of the three tramps in this famous photo taken moments after the assassination. The identity of the three men in the photo is often debated, but, as theorized by numerous Kennedy researchers, the third man in the photo, as I've highlighted here, does share a resemblance with Hunt. He clearly had a motive for being involved in the plot, following JFK's reluctance in providing air support to the Bay of Pigs invaders, an operation that Hunt himself was deeply involved with. The failure of the operation and Kennedy's refusal to call the CIA's bluff left Hunt embarrassed by his failure and emboldened against JFK. Following the Bay of Pigs fiasco, which would see Kennedy fire longtime director of the CIA Allen Dulles, Hunt, alongside an array of other CIA men, continued to visit the Dulles household throughout the years of 1962 and 63. Again, according to David Talbot, referring to now declassified correspondences between Hunt and Dulles, Hunt sought Dulles' help in finding a career in private intelligence, after feeling disillusionment with the agency following the Bay of Pigs disaster. It was likely that the two spies found solace in their shared perceived martyrdom, Allen Dulles for overstepping the president and getting fired, and Hunt for his key role in organizing the doomed operation. Howard Hunt ultimately decided to remain with the agency, and officially helped Dulles work on his memoirs in the following years. Researchers, however, speculate that the meetings that took place throughout the years of 62 and 63 at the Dulles household had a more sinister purpose, likely tied to the Kennedy assassination in November of 1963. The crestfallen spymaster would host such CIA guests as counterintelligence czar James Jesus Angleton, head of the Directorate of Plans and future CIA director under Nixon, Richard Helms, which I have to mention here got his start in China as well with the OSS, like Hunt and the other Detachment 202 men, propaganda expert Cord Meyer, and, finally, Dulles' replacement as CIA director, John McCoy. Of course, Hunt was present at many of these meetings. These informal meetings with the former head of the CIA would fuel speculation of CIA involvement in the events of November 22, 1963. Finally, in the early 1970s, Hunt would return to the spotlight as one of Nixon's plumbers, a secret group of operators that worked under the Nixon White House covertly as political fixers. I don't want to get too far into Watergate here because there's a lot of nuance surrounding the plumbers that I don't really have time to get into here. What's important though is that Hunt would be instrumental in planning and executing the Watergate burglary. Hunt would be forced to testify in front of the Senate Watergate Committee and would finally serve 33 months in prison for his involvement. After his release, Hunt moved to Mexico and finally settled down in Florida. In one last wink and a nod, Hunt would deliver potentially the most famous deathbed confession before his death about his understanding of the Kennedy assassination. Through his son St. John Hunt, a terminally ill Howard Hunt outlined his understanding of the Kennedy plot on a piece of paper, which would be reported in Rolling Stone magazine in 2007. According to Howard Hunt's son, his father alleged that the conspiracy to kill the president included, in order of hierarchy, Lyndon Johnson, Cord Meyer, you'll remember him from the Dulles House meetings we just talked about, David Atlee Phillips, Frank Sturgis, David Morales, Antonio Veciana, William Harvey, and a, quote, French gunman on the grassy knoll. Personally, in my opinion, I do not take this allegation all too seriously for many reasons. For one, its publication in a mainstream publication such as Rolling Stone strikes me as suspect. But most glaring to me is the lack of any organized crime figures within Hunt's model. My research into the Kennedy assassination has confirmed for me anyways that there was a fundamental mob element in the conspiracy that is clearly missing in this confession. Also, conveniently missing is Hunt himself in this whole operation, which makes this confession oddly vindicating for the dying spook. There are also several allegations that Hunt's sons coerced their dying father into producing a confession, which do hold some ground, as St. John Hunt used the end of the article to plug his new band, potentially voiding this whole article as a publicity stunt. I fundamentally believe that the deathbed confession by Howard Hunt is probably half true. I hold the belief that whenever a CIA agent does a tell-all or comes out on a mainstream publication or program and reveals classified information, they use a strategy of info dumping, which essentially works to obscure the narrative with a flurry of false information interlaced with truthful information. Not unlike a limited hangout, this info dump strategy works to confuse the narrative and throw researchers into rabbit holes that are fruitless or dead ends, thus obscuring the real narrative within the false one. Either way, your opinion on this strange confession is as good as mine, and it is nonetheless interesting to speculate as to the veracity of the allegations. I would love to hear your thoughts below. So our first member of OSS Detachment 202, the Spook, Howard Hunt, is one of high intrigue, spycraft, and covert operations. But it all started in China under Paul Helliwell. Interestingly, many have pegged Helliwell as a key paymaster for the Bay of Pigs invasion, as I've mentioned before, which would see Hunt and Helliwell reunited in southern Florida in the 1960s. We'll get much more into detail about all that when we get to the Bay of Pigs, which I plan on doing a few episodes on. However, for now we move on to our second member of OSS Detachment 202, and that would be the General, who is Major General John K. Singlob. John Singlob would go on to be one of the most prominent leaders of American counterinsurgency strategy and guerrilla warfare. His resume is staggering, having served in Korea, China, Laos, and Vietnam, and having allegedly trained paramilitary forces in Nicaragua and Afghanistan. He was most famous for being the U.S. Army official in charge of the secret war in Laos in the 60s and 70s, providing operational support to Vang Phao's forces in the mountains of the Golden Triangle. We'll be focusing heavily on Laos in our upcoming episodes on Indochina, and we'll track Vang Phao's development throughout the conflict in the region. In 1977, Singlob would be relieved from duty for criticizing President Jimmy Carter's policy of troop drawdowns in South Korea, which led to his storied career as a private citizen. Singlob would become one of the main figures in the dark money networks associated to Iran-Contra. With funding from Texas oil billionaire Nelson Bunker Hunt, not related to Howard Hunt by the way, Singlob would found the Western Goals Foundation, a private intelligence firm that funded the Contras in Central America, mainly in Nicaragua and Honduras. He would also lead the U.S. Council on World Freedoms in 1980, and served as a consultant on a company called GeoMilitech, which worked as a liaison between arms dealers and anti-communist guerrilla forces in Afghanistan and Central America. Both of these guerrilla armies would be intrinsically tied to the narcotics trade, and John Singlob had a wealth of experience in this area, from his time in China under Helliwell, and his work in Laos managing the secret war along the Ho Chi Minh Trail during the Vietnam War. Singlob essentially embodied a similar role in the 1980s to the role Helliwell undertook in the 1950s and 60s. He worked to manage the organizations and shell companies that ensured the untraceable funds reached the forces that the American security state could not openly support. We will see Singlob pop up later in this video, as he had close associations with another OSS Detachment 202 man. Overall, Singlob and the men of the OSS Detachment 202 would become the architects of Cold War guerrilla warfare, and generally would go on to make a massive imprint on the global program of the CIA. One of the stranger members of OSS Detachment 202 was the operator, Lucien Connet, a French-born, Kansas City-raised recruit who served with both the French and US armies during the war. In 1943, he was called up to the OSS and would end his time in World War II in China under Halliwell's forces. According to a biography of Connet, he worked to train irregular forces along the border of French Indochina against the occupying Japanese forces. His campaign was successful and he remained in Vietnam briefly after the war, but ultimately declined a recruitment offer from French intelligence. He allegedly met with Ho Chi Minh in Saigon and was convinced that he had to be countered. He served the next 9 years with the CIA in post-war Germany before returning to Vietnam in 1954, working under CIA attaché Edward Lansdale as his top aide, who we will get to later when we discuss the First Indochina War. Connet had allegedly forged strong ties with the local French population in Vietnam, specifically the Corsican mobsters in the region, some of which he had met in Marseille during his time serving in the French army during World War II. Connet would become one of the main point men in the CIA's war in Vietnam in the late 1950s and mid-1960s, serving under legendary counterinsurgency expert Edward Lansdale, who was, according to Alfred McCoy, Allen Dulles' main liaison in southern Vietnam. Connet and Lansdale would work to pacify the Laos-Vietnam border, and Connet specifically helped establish a narcotics connection between the Corsican mobsters in Saigon and Vang Pao's guerrilla army in Laos. He was instrumental to the Strategic Hamlet program in Vietnam and other controversial counterinsurgency programs under the Accords program, and would eventually give the green light to the South Vietnamese generals to kill South Vietnam's president Ngo Dinh Diem in 1963, one of the last defining moments of the Kennedy presidency. Finally, to end his career in a poetic fashion, Howard Hunt, the spook we talked about earlier, recommended that Nixon hire Lucien Connet as a narcotics advisor in the White House. Following Watergate, Connet ended his career in the mid-1970s as the chief of covert operations for the DEA. He later admitted that he worked with Corsican mobsters while in the role, as he had previously under Edward Lansdale in Vietnam. With Lucien Connet, we can clearly see the importance of narcotics smuggling to counterinsurgency work in Vietnam. As a main figure within the global narcotics paradigm, Connet was uniquely placed to ensure that dope continued to flow to fund the secret armies in Laos and to fund activities downstream, a major focus of our upcoming French Connection series. Finally, maybe the most obscure and spooky character amongst the OSS Detachment 202 crowd was the mercenary, Mitchell Werbel III. According to his own account, Werbel was the son of a Russian-American father who worked as a liaison between the White Russian forces and the US government during the Russian Civil War in the late 1910s and early 1920s. Born in Pennsylvania, Werbel III would go on to join the OSS during the war, working under Halliwell in China behind Japanese lines. This marked the beginning of a long career for Werbel in counterinsurgency and guerrilla warfare. I sourced much of this sparse information on Werbel from a December 1970 article in the Atlanta magazine that was transcribed by the Washington Post. I have linked the Washington Post excerpts below. It's a great read. The article includes extensive statements by Werbel during an interview sometime in 1970. It is stated that in 1948, while Werbel's anti-communist activities were, quote, still just a hobby, he purchased the Dobbs estate in Powder Springs, Georgia, a small town in the outskirts of Atlanta. There, Werbel founded several private paramilitary and defense research firms. Most famously, he founded Psionics, a weapon technology development company that patented the first suppressors for submachine guns, most famously the MAC-10 machine pistol or submachine gun. Eventually, Werbel's Psionics would be absorbed by the manufacturer of the MAC-10, Cobray, and Werbel's firm would supply weapons to governments around the world, including the US security apparatus. Of course, this development has concerning implications for the future covert operations undertaken by Werbel and the CIA, which he was closely affiliated to, and not to mention potential assassination programs that the CIA would become quite famous for. This is corroborated in a fantastic interview for a documentary called American Mercenaries, the true story of Mitch Werbel, which I linked to below. In the doc, General John Singlaub, a fellow member of OSS Detachment 202, claims that Mitch Werbel was active in Vietnam, providing suppressors and, quote, specialized weapons to South Vietnamese and American forces. Let's play Singlaub's testimony in this documentary. You will see that he appears quite close to Werbel, and they appear to have worked together in their later careers.
clandestine operations. He's an expert on weapons, particularly on special types of weapons, silencers and so forth. He has the respect of a lot of the ex-special forces people that have either worked with him in these operations or know of him and know that he has these connections. And he has an ability to bring all of this together when it is needed.
Although, Werbel does explicitly specify in the Atlanta magazine interview that he is not an employee of the CIA, instead working independently through his various companies to support anti-communist regimes across the globe as a paramilitary advisor. Werbel would work in the Dominican Republic for the Trujillo regime and in Cuba for the Bautista regime in the 1950s, and would support the brutal regime of François Duvalier in Haiti in the 1960s. All these operations were coordinated through his private defense firm Environmental Industries, which was a private military contracting company with offices based in DC. That offered operational and military support to paying governments. Werbel states that his specialization was in counterinsurgency work, and that he advised his clients on how to repel hostile coup attempts. Werbel's allegiances shifted quickly and unexpectedly throughout his career. In 1966, for example, he was involved in a coup against the Duvalier government in Haiti, a government that he had once been employed by. He was reportedly also involved in anti-Castro operations, as he stated in an interview with journalist Gaten Fonzi in his book The Last Investigation, quote, "I was sitting in Miami with a goddamn $1 million in cash for the guy who was going to take Fidel out," drawing a potential post-war link between Miami paymaster Paul Helliwell and Mitch Werbel. I will leave you all with one last chilling quote that has stuck with me from his interview with Gaten Fonzi. Werbel exclaimed, quote, "I have been in so many places, so many countries, so many revolutions. It's beginning to all get mixed up in my mind. And to me, this is a perfect encapsulation of not only Mitch Werbel, but also the four figures I highlighted that came out of OSS Detachment 202 under Colonel Helliwell. This group of men embodied the true nature of the operator mindset, working across the globe in the underworld and in the shadows, shaping the world with guns, money, and narcotics." So, to conclude this whirlwind round of biographies, the reason I wanted to highlight these four men is to show the transcontinental quality of the covert American project. As we dive into the French Connection and use that backdrop to investigate the CIA's global mission in the 1950s, we will see that the narcotics-affiliated operations in Southeast Asia, Europe, and Latin America are all intrinsically linked by one continuous flow of funds. This was not by accident, it was by design. By tracking the activities of the spook E. Howard Hunt, the General John Singlob, the operator Lucien Connet, and the mercenary Mitch Werbel, we see the global mission in action. This perspective will hopefully help you all see the cross-cutting linkages that will be presented in the next several parts. I hope you all enjoyed this shorter prelude to what's coming. If you enjoyed this shorter form video, please let me know. It takes me substantially less time to make something like this, and hopefully this tides you over till my next full-length documentary coming up shortly. In the next two videos, which will both be full-length, we will be doing a deep dive into Southeast Asia. Firstly, in the first video, we will be looking at the CIA operations in Burma that would form the prototype for future operations across the globe. Then, in part 2, we will be taking a look at the First Indochina War between France and Vietnam, and also be sort of looking at the prelude of Vietnam and American involvement. I hope to see you all there. As always, I want to thank my patrons for their ongoing support. I really couldn't do it without you guys, so thank you. I was recently able to upgrade my audio equipment thanks to their generosity. I hope you all heard the difference. I think this mic sounds great, so it's been an amazing upgrade. Thank you again. As always, a like goes a long way in the algorithm, and I'm always happy to hear what your thoughts are in the comments. Maybe let me know down below anything that I might have left out about these characters that you think is really important. I always appreciate when people do that in the comments and share some of their favorite anecdotes about these characters. I didn't have time to fit everything, so really, anything that I might have left out that you think was relevant, please leave it down below for people to read. Thank you all for watching again, and as always, remember to keep your eyes wide open. Take care.